The galaxy had known only one master for 2,000 years. The Zephyrian Empire stretched across 300 star systems like a steel fist wrapped around the throat of civilization. Their massive warships patrolled the void between worlds, each one capable of turning entire planets into lifeless rocks. No species dared to challenge them because everyone knew what happened to those who tried. Captain Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of the USS Nevada, watching the stars drift past through the main viewer. His ship was small compared to the Zephyrian dreadnoughts that enforced galactic law. The Nevada was just a frigate, built by human hands in the shipyards above Earth. She carried 43 crew members and enough firepower to maybe scratch the paint on a real warship. Humanity had learned to keep its head down. They paid their tribute every year like good little subjects, 10% of their food production, 5% of their population for labor camps, and complete submission to Zephyrian authority. It was the price of survival in a galaxy where might made right. Commander Lisa Parker approached the captain's chair with a datapad in her hands. Her face looked troubled as she handed over the daily reports. 3 more human colonies had increased their tribute payments this month. The Zephyrians were squeezing harder, testing how much they could take before their subjects broke. Jake read through the numbers and felt his jaw tighten. New Denver was on the list. The mining colony had been struggling to meet their quotas for months. Their equipment was old and their workers were exhausted. Still, the Zephyrians demanded more. Chief Engineer Ryan Torres climbed up from the lower decks, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. The Nevada's engines were holding together with spare parts and prayers. Human technology was decades behind the galactic standard, but it was theirs. Every bolt and wire had been crafted by human hands with human sweat. The ship's communication array crackled to life. Communications Officer Amy Richardson turned in her seat with wide eyes. She had been monitoring the standard frequencies when something unexpected came through. A distress signal from New Denver, weak and broken but unmistakably real. Jake moved to Amy's station and listened to the transmission. The voice belonged to Colony Administrator Frank Morrison, a man Jake had met once during a supply run. Frank sounded scared in a way that made Jake's blood run cold. The Zephyrians had arrived at New Denver with 3 destroyers. They were not there to collect tribute. The transmission cut to static and then reformed into something else. A Zephyrian voice spoke in their harsh language, translated by the ship's computer into cold mechanical words. New Denver had requested a reduction in their tribute payments. The colony claimed their equipment was failing and their people were dying from overwork. Such defiance could not be tolerated. Admiral Kethvar of the 3rd Zephyrian Fleet had been dispatched to make an example. The entire population of New Denver would be eliminated using the compliance protocol. Their atmosphere would be stripped away, leaving 12,000 human souls to die in the vacuum of space. The process would take 6 hours and would be broadcast across human space as a warning. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. 12,000 people. Men, women, children who had done nothing wrong except ask for mercy from masters who knew none. The Nevada was 3 hours away at maximum burn. They could reach New Denver before the execution began. Lisa Parker studied the tactical display with professional calm. 3 Zephyrian destroyers against 1 human frigate was not a fight. It was suicide. Each enemy ship carried enough firepower to vaporize the Nevada 10 times over. Their shields could absorb anything the human ship could throw at them. The smart play was to retreat and file a protest through proper diplomatic channels. Ryan Torres shook his head as he looked at the engine readouts. The Nevada could run, but she could not hide. Zephyrian sensors would track them across half the galaxy if they tried to flee. Better to maintain their patrol route and pretend they had never heard the distress call. Amy Richardson had tears in her eyes as she listened to more fragments of transmission from New Denver. Children crying for their parents. Adults trying to remain calm as death approached from the sky. The Zephyrians were not just killing them. They were savoring their fear. Jake Sullivan had served in the human navy for 15 years. He had watched his people bow and scrape before alien masters who viewed them as barely above animals. He had followed orders and paid tribute and told himself that survival was more important than dignity. But as he listened to those voices from New Denver, something inside him snapped. The captain turned to his crew and saw his own anger reflected in their faces. These were good people who had signed up to protect human colonies. They had families of their own scattered across human space. Any one of those families could be next on the Zephyrian list. Pilot Danny Mitchell spoke up from his station near the front of the bridge. He was young and eager, fresh from the academy with dreams of making a difference. The boy wanted to know if they were really going to let those people die. His question hung in the air like an accusation. Jake looked at each member of his crew in turn. Lisa Parker with her steady tactical mind. Ryan Torres with his genius for making broken machines work. Amy Richardson with her gift for finding signals in the noise of space. Danny Mitchell with his youth and idealism intact. These people trusted him to make the right choice. The captain walked to the center of the bridge and activated the ship's internal communications. His voice carried to every corner of the Nevada as he spoke to his crew. They all knew what was happening at New Denver. They all knew the odds of survival if they intervened. But they also knew what it meant to be human. Humanity had survived the Ice Age and the Plague Years and the long journey to the stars. They had faced extinction before and chosen to fight rather than fade away. The Zephyrians had superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to stay down. Jake Sullivan gave the order that would change everything. The USS Nevada altered course for New Denver at maximum burn. They would arrive just as the Zephyrian fleet began their execution of 12,000 innocent people. It was not a rescue mission because rescue was impossible. It was something else entirely. 3 hours later, the Nevada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the New Denver system. The Zephyrian destroyers hung in orbit above the colony like vultures waiting to feed. Their weapons were already charging. For the first strike that would begin 6 hours of methodical murder, Jake Sullivan opened a Wii channel on all frequencies and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. The USS Nevada hung in space like a tiny metal fish facing 3 massive sharks. Jake Sullivan stood on his bridge and opened communications to the Zephyrian fleet. His voice carried across the void with absolute clarity and purpose that surprised even his own crew. "This is Captain Jake Sullivan of the United Earth Navy," he announced to the galaxy. "You will not harm these people while I draw breath." Admiral Kethvar responded from his flagship with what the translation computer rendered as laughter. The sound was harsh and grating like metal scraping against stone. A single human vessel dared to challenge the might of the Zephyrian Empire. It was beyond comprehension. In 2,000 years of conquest, no species had been foolish enough to oppose them with such pathetic force. The Zephyrian admiral activated his weapon systems and prepared to teach this upstart captain the price of defiance. 3 destroyers against 1 frigate was not even sport. It was pest control. The human ship would be vaporized in seconds and the lesson would continue as planned. 12,000 colonists would still die, but now their deaths would serve a greater purpose. Lisa Parker hunched over her tactical station and fed targeting data to the Nevada's weapons. The ship carried 30 nuclear missiles, 4 railgun turrets, and a desperate hope that human ingenuity could overcome impossible odds. She knew the mathematics of the engagement better than anyone. The Zephyrian shields could absorb their entire arsenal without faltering, but mathematics had never stopped humans before. When the first European explorers set sail into unknown oceans, the numbers said they would fall off the edge of the world. When the Wright brothers built their flying machine, physics said it would never leave the ground. When humanity reached for the stars, every rational calculation said they would die in the cold vacuum of space. Jake Sullivan gave the order to attack just as the lead Zephyrian destroyer fired its main weapons. Beams of coherent energy lanced across space toward the Nevada, while human missiles streaked in the opposite direction. The difference was that the Zephyrian captain expected his shot to end the fight. Jake Sullivan was just getting started. Danny Mitchell threw the Nevada into a spiraling dive that defied every principle of space combat doctrine. The Zephyrian energy beams passed through empty space where the human ship should have been. No sane pilot would attempt such a maneuver in the middle of weapons range. The gravitational stress should have torn the Nevada apart. Ryan Torres felt every bolt and weld in the ship's frame as Danny pushed their vessel beyond its design limits. The engine screamed at 90% power, while the inertial compensators struggled to keep the crew from being crushed by their own momentum. But the ship held together because human engineers had built her to take punishment and keep fighting. The Nevada's missiles struck the first Zephyrian destroyer and exploded against its shields in brilliant flashes of nuclear fire. The enemy vessel absorbed the attack without visible damage, exactly as predicted. But something unexpected happened in the moment after impact. The destroyer's shields flickered for just an instant as they recycled their energy matrix. Amy Richardson caught the scanner readings and shouted the information to Lisa Parker. The Zephyrian shields had a weakness that their computer models had missed. For 3 seconds after absorbing a major impact, the shield generators needed to reset their harmonics. During that brief window, the shields were vulnerable to a different type of attack. Lisa Parker processed this information faster than thought and adjusted her targeting solution. The Nevada's railguns fired solid tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of light speed. The projectiles struck the Zephyrian destroyer just as its shields completed their reset cycle. Kinetic weapons punched through the barrier and tore into the enemy hull like bullets through paper. The first Zephyrian destroyer listed to port as atmosphere vented from multiple hull breaches. Its captain could not believe what had happened. Human weapons had actually damaged a ship of the Imperial fleet. It was impossible, but the evidence was written in twisted metal and sparking conduits across his vessel. Admiral Kethvar ordered his remaining ships to concentrate their fire on the human vessel. The Nevada danced between energy beams like a dancer avoiding raindrops, but there were too many weapons and too little space. Danny Mitchell could not dodge forever against 3 ships firing simultaneously. Jake Sullivan made a decision that would have horrified any rational commander. He ordered Ryan Torres to overload the ship's fusion reactor, while Danny Mitchell laid in a direct course for the damaged Zephyrian destroyer. The Nevada would ram the enemy vessel at maximum velocity and detonate her power core on impact. The crew of the Nevada understood what their captain was asking. It was a suicide mission with no possibility of survival. But as they looked at their instruments and saw the Zephyrian weapons preparing to execute 12,000 innocent people, the choice became clear. Better to die fighting than live with the knowledge that they could have made a difference. Ryan Torres began the reactor overload sequence while Danny Mitchell pushed the engines past their safety limits. The Nevada accelerated toward the wounded Zephyrian destroyer like a spear thrown by an angry god. Energy beams from the other enemy ships hammered their hull and tore away pieces of armor. But they could not stop the human vessel's final charge. Lisa Parker fired every remaining weapon at the target destroyer as they approached. Missiles and railgun slugs cleared the way for their desperate gambit. The Zephyrian captain tried to maneuver his damaged ship out of the collision course, but his engines had been hit in the previous exchange. The USS Nevada struck the Zephyrian destroyer amidships at 60% of light speed. The impact alone would have destroyed both vessels, but Ryan Torres had timed the reactor overload perfectly. The fusion explosion turned both ships into an expanding ball of plasma that lit up the New Denver system like a second. Son Admiral Kethvar watched his destroyer. Diane felt something he had not experienced in centuries of conquest, uncertainty. One human ship had destroyed, a vessel of the Imperial fleet, through sheer determination and tactical madness. If humans were capable of such acts, what did that mean for the Empire's future? The remaining Zephyrian ships held their fire as debris from the explosion rained down across space. The colonists on New Denver looked up at the sky and saw the artificial star fading to darkness. They knew that 43 humans had just died to save 12,000 strangers. The sacrifice was beyond comprehension. Amy Richardson's final transmission had been broadcast across human space before the Nevada died. Her last act was to send the tactical data about Zephyrian shield vulnerabilities to every human vessel in the fleet. The information spread like wildfire through communication networks that the Empire had thought secure. Admiral Kethvar made the decision to withdraw his remaining forces from New Denver. The mission had become complicated beyond his original parameters. He needed to report this incident to higher authority and determine how the Empire should respond to such unprecedented defiance. But the damage was already done. Across human space, the story of the Nevada's last stand spread from colony to colony. Captain Jake Sullivan and his crew had proven that the Zephyrian Empire could bleed. More importantly, they had shown that humans would choose death before dishonor. News of the Nevada's sacrifice spread through human space faster than light itself. Every merchant vessel, every communication relay, every hidden listening post carried the story to every human colony in the galaxy. Captain Jake Sullivan and his crew of 43 had become something more than heroes. They had become proof that humans could fight back. Admiral Kate Morrison sat in her command center on Mars Station, reviewing reports that would have been impossible just days earlier. 17 human colonies had refused to pay their weekly tribute to the Zephyrian Empire. Mining stations were reporting mysterious equipment failures that prevented them from meeting production quotas. Merchant captains were filing complaints about pirate attacks that seemed remarkably well coordinated. The Zephyrian response was swift and predictable. They demanded that humanity surrender 10 million citizens for immediate execution as punishment for the Nevada's terrorist attack. The alternative was the complete sterilization of all human worlds, using the same compliance protocol that had threatened New Denver. The deadline was 30 days. Most of the human leadership counseled immediate surrender. President David Carter of the Colonial Council argued that 10 million deaths were preferable to the extinction of the entire species. Governor Sarah Martinez of the Outer Rim colonies agreed. They had survived for centuries by accepting their place in the galactic order. Why risk everything now for a meaningless gesture of defiance? But something had changed in the human spirit since word of the Nevada reached every corner of their space. On the manufacturing world of New Pittsburgh, factory supervisor Tony Garcia stood before his workers and spoke words that would have meant death just a week earlier. The Zephyrians wanted 10 million slaves to feed their war machine. Tony Garcia said they could have 0. The workers of New Pittsburgh began converting their industrial plants from consumer goods to weapons production. They had no blueprints for military hardware, so they designed their own. Simple railguns that could be mounted on civilian spacecraft, nuclear devices that could be triggered by desperate cruise and suicide attacks, armor plating that could be welded onto merchant hulls. Dr. Helen Carter worked 18-hour days in her xenobiology laboratory on Europa Station, studying every scrap of information humanity had gathered about Zephyrian physiology. The Empire had ruled through fear for so long that they had grown careless about protecting their secrets. Helen found weaknesses that no one had bothered to look for before. Zephyrian soldiers were strong and fast, but they required a specific atmospheric mixture to function at peak efficiency. Their cybernetic implants could be disrupted by electromagnetic pulses of the right frequency. Most importantly, their command structure was rigid and hierarchical. Cut off the head, and the body would thrash blindly for crucial seconds. Captain Ben Clark commanded a convoy of armed merchant vessels that had begun hunting Zephyrian supply ships along the trade routes. His fleet consisted of converted freighters and passenger liners that should have been no match for Imperial patrol craft. But Ben had learned the lessons of the Nevada's last stand. When Zephyrian escorts dropped their shields to reset after absorbing missile impacts, Ben's ships swarmed them with kinetic weapons. When enemy commanders tried to follow standard tactical doctrine, human captains did the unexpected and impossible. 3 Zephyrian supply convoys had been destroyed in the past week, and their escorts had been left as debris fields. The rebellion was spreading beyond human space. On the insectoid worlds of the Kepler sector, the hive minds began refusing orders from their Zephyrian overseers. The aquatic deep swimmers stopped delivering their tribute of rare minerals from the ocean floors of their home planets. Dozens of species that had been silent for centuries were finding their voices again. Intelligence officer Carol Williams had spent her career analyzing Zephyrian military capabilities and political structures. Her research had been theoretical until the Nevada's sacrifice made it suddenly relevant. What she discovered would have been classified as fantasy, if anyone had bothered to classify it at all. The Zephyrian Empire was far more fragile than anyone realized. Their advanced technology required resources from hundreds of conquered worlds to maintain. Their massive fleet was spread thin across 300 star systems, with most ships operating at minimal crew levels. The facade of invincible strength was maintained through careful propaganda and the systematic elimination of anyone who questioned their power. Carol's intelligence reports reached General Paul Jackson, commander of the human deep space forces. Paul had been planning a defensive strategy that would minimize casualties when the Zephyrians arrived to collect their 10 million hostages. Now he began developing something entirely different. The scattered human forces received new orders through coded transmissions. Instead of preparing for siege warfare, they would launch preemptive strikes against Zephyrian installations throughout the galaxy. The attacks would be coordinated, with rebellions on other worlds to maximize the chaos and confusion. In the Imperial command structure, Captain Maria Santos led the first assault on a Zephyrian listening post in the Alpha Centauri system. Her destroyer Phoenix carried a crew of volunteers who had all lost family members to Imperial tribute collections. They approached the enemy station using the Nevada's tactics, striking fast and hard before disappearing into the void. The listening post died in a ball of nuclear fire, taking with it the communication relay that coordinated Zephyrian forces across 6 star systems. Similar attacks were happening simultaneously throughout human space as captains who had spent their careers in peaceful service became warriors overnight. On Earth, the birthworld of humanity, massive demonstrations filled the streets of every major city. Citizens who had accepted their fate for generations suddenly demanded action from their leaders. The Nevada had shown them that death was preferable to submission, and they would accept no compromise with tyranny. Kevin Roberts commanded a squadron of fighter craft that had been modified for long-range operation. His pilots were young and reckless, volunteers from the civilian transport services who had learned to fly in the peaceful years before the rebellion. They struck Zephyrian patrol vessels and vanished into asteroid fields before the enemy could respond. The Empire's response was everything General Jackson had predicted. Massive fleets were recalled from frontier duties to crush the human insurrection. But as Zephyrian forces concentrated in human space, rebellions erupted on dozens of other worlds that had been left undefended. Admiral Morrison reviewed the tactical situation from her command post and realized that humanity had accomplished something unprecedented. They had not just defied the Zephyrian Empire. They had inspired a galaxy-wide revolution that threatened to tear apart 2,000 years of imperial rule. The 10 million hostages that the Zephyrians demanded would never be delivered. Human colonies were fortifying their defenses and preparing for siege warfare that might last for years. More importantly, they were no longer fighting alone. The galaxy that had been silent under imperial rule was finally awakening to the possibility of freedom. Jake Sullivan and his crew had died believing they were saving 12,000 people on New Denver. They could never have imagined that their sacrifice would light a fire that spread from star to star, igniting the hope of trillions of beings who had forgotten what it meant to be free. The Nevada's final message was being heard across the galaxy, and the response was louder than anyone had dared to dream. Emperor Theknoth received the reports of rebellion from across his empire with the cold fury of a monarch who had never been challenged. For 2,000 years, the Zephyrian Empire had maintained order through overwhelming force and the complete submission of inferior species. Now these humans had shattered that order with a single act of defiance that inspired others to follow their example. The Emperor's flagship, the Dominion Eternal, was a vessel larger than most space stations. It carried enough firepower to reduce entire planets to molten slag and served as the mobile command center for the Imperial fleet. Theknoth ordered the ship to human space, along with 200 of the Empire's most powerful warships. This would not be a simple punitive expedition like the countless others that had crushed rebellions before. The Emperor himself would oversee the complete extermination of humanity and any species foolish enough to support them. The lesson would be so terrible that no being in the galaxy would dare to challenge Zephyrian authority for another 2,000 years. Admiral Morrison watched the massive enemy fleet approaching on her long-range sensors and knew that conventional warfare would be suicide. The Zephyrian armada could destroy every human vessel in open battle without taking significant losses. But humanity had learned from the Nevada's example that victory was not always about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it was about making their victory so costly that they questioned whether it was worth the price. Captain Maria Santos led the first wave of attacks against the Imperial supply lines. Her destroyer Phoenix had been joined by dozens of other vessels crewed by volunteers, who understood they were probably flying to their deaths. They struck Zephyrian fuel depots and ammunition convoys, forcing the enemy fleet to divert escort vessels to protect their logistics. The human tactics were unlike anything the Zephyrians had encountered before. Instead of forming battle lines and exchanging fire like civilized opponents, the humans fought like wild animals. They used ramming attacks, reactor overloads, and suicide runs that violated every principle of space warfare. More importantly, they refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Captain Kevin Roberts adapted his fighter squadrons to hunt Zephyrian patrol craft in the asteroid belts and nebula clouds that dotted human space. His pilots had learned to use their environment as a weapon, luring enemy vessels into gravity wells and radiation storms that could disable even the most advanced ships. The Empire's superior technology meant nothing when they could not bring it to bear. Dr. Helen Carter's research had identified 17 different ways to disrupt Zephyrian cybernetic implants using modified communication equipment. Her discoveries were being implemented by resistance cells throughout the galaxy, turning the Empire's own enhancement technology against them. Zephyrian soldiers were finding their targeting systems, failing at critical moments in their coordination networks, collapsing under electronic attacks, and the rebellion was spreading faster than the Imperial fleet could respond. On the aquatic worlds of the deep swimmers, massive sea creatures began attacking Zephyrian underwater installations. The insectoid hive minds coordinated simultaneous uprisings across their entire sector, overwhelming Imperial garrison forces through sheer numbers. Even species that had been completely pacified for centuries were remembering how to fight. Intelligence Officer Carol Williams had established communication networks that allowed the scattered rebel forces to coordinate their efforts. Her analysis of Zephyrian fleet movements allowed human commanders to predict enemy actions and position their forces accordingly. The Empire's rigid command structure was becoming a liability as rebel forces learned to exploit their predictable responses. Emperor Theknoth arrived in human space to find his empire burning from within. The human insurrection had become a galaxy-wide revolution that threatened everything his ancestors had built. Worse still, the humans continued to fight with a ferocity that defied all rational calculation. They seemed to prefer death to submission, a concept that the Emperor found genuinely disturbing. General Paul Jackson coordinated the human defense from a mobile command post that moved constantly to avoid detection. His strategy was simple in concept but devastating in execution. Human forces would trade space for time, bleeding the Zephyrian fleet with hit-and-run attacks while avoiding decisive battles. Every day the war continued. More species joined the rebellion. The first major engagement between the Imperial fleet and human forces took place near the industrial world of New Pittsburgh. 50 Zephyrian warships moved to pacify the planet and restore tribute collection. They were met by a mixed force of human vessels, converted merchant ships, and volunteer crews who had received barely a week of combat training. The battle was a slaughter that should have ended in complete Zephyrian victory. The Imperial ships destroyed 2/3 of the human fleet in the first hour of combat, but the survivors continued to fight with suicidal determination, ramming damaged vessels into enemy ships and detonating their reactors at point-blank range. When the smoke cleared, the Zephyrians had lost 7 warships to an enemy that should have been swept aside like debris. Captain Ben Clark's merchant convoy had grown into a full fleet of armed freighters and passenger liners that hunted Zephyrian supply ships throughout the galaxy. His forces operated in coordination with rebel fleets from dozens of other species, sharing intelligence and coordinating attacks. The Empire's vast logistical network was beginning to collapse under the strain of defending against attacks from every direction. Tony Garcia's weapons factories on New Pittsburgh were producing military hardware at a rate that amazed even their designers. Human ingenuity had found ways to mass-produce railguns, missiles, and armor plating using industrial equipment never intended for military use. More importantly, the factory workers were sharing their designs with rebel forces throughout the galaxy. The war was becoming a test of endurance rather than military prowess. The Zephyrian Empire possessed superior technology and overwhelming firepower, but they were discovering that their enemies had something more valuable. The humans and their rebel allies were fighting for their freedom, while the Imperial forces were fighting to maintain their privilege. One side was willing to sacrifice everything for victory, while the other was beginning to question whether victory was worth the cost. Emperor Theknoth found himself commanding a fleet that was winning every major battle, while somehow losing the war. His forces could destroy any enemy formation they encountered, but new rebel fleets appeared faster than they could be eliminated. The humans had shown the galaxy that the Empire could be hurt, and that knowledge was spreading like a plague. Captain Danny Mitchell had survived the destruction of his original ship, and now commanded a squadron of captured Zephyrian vessels. His crews had learned to operate enemy technology through trial and error, turning the Empire's own weapons against them. The psychological impact of seeing their ships in rebel hands was devastating. To Imperial morale, Admiral Morrison received Reports that rebel fleets were now operating in over 200 star systems simultaneously. The coordination required for such operations should have been impossible without the Empire's communication networks. But human engineers had reverse-engineered Zephyrian technology and built their own command structure. The Emperor realized that his empire was facing something unprecedented in its long history. This was not a rebellion that could be crushed through superior force. It was a revolution that drew strength from every act of imperial brutality. The more harshly he responded to rebel attacks, the more species joined the uprising against his rule. The galaxy that had been silent for 2,000 years was finally finding its voice, and that voice was calling for the end of the Zephyrian Empire. The final battle for the freedom of the galaxy began in the home system of the Zephyrian Empire itself. Emperor Theknoth had withdrawn his remaining forces to the massive fortress world that had served as the seat of imperial power for 2 millennia. The planet was surrounded by orbital weapons platforms, defensive satellites, and the last 100 warships of what had once been an invincible fleet. Admiral Kate Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Nevada II, a ship built in honor of the vessel that had started this galactic revolution. Around her, the combined rebel fleet stretched as far as sensors could detect. Humans fought alongside insectoid hive minds, aquatic deep swimmers, and dozens of other species that had found the courage to demand their freedom. The approaching battle would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Thousands of ships from hundreds of worlds were converging on the Zephyrian homeworld, each crew carrying the hopes of their people and the memory of those who had died under imperial oppression. But they all knew that Emperor Theknoth would not surrender his throne without exacting a terrible price. Captain Maria Santos led the first wave of attacks against the outer defensive perimeter. Her ship Phoenix had been rebuilt twice since the war began, each time incorporating new technology captured from defeated Zephyrian vessels. She and her crew had become legends throughout the rebel fleet, symbols of the human refusal to accept defeat. The orbital weapons platforms opened fire as the rebel fleet entered weapons range, filling space with beams of energy that could vaporize capital ships in seconds. But the attacking forces had learned from every battle of the past year. They came in fast and low, using the gravity well of the planet itself to mask their approach and confuse enemy targeting systems. Dr. Helen Carter's electromagnetic pulse weapons proved devastatingly effective against the Zephyrian defensive systems. Modified human vessels broadcast signals that disrupted the cybernetic implants of enemy crews, causing coordination failures throughout the Imperial formation. The technological advantage that had maintained Zephyrian dominance for centuries was finally being neutralized. Captain Kevin Roberts coordinated bomber attacks against the Fortress World surface installations. His pilots flew converted civilian craft loaded with nuclear weapons, diving through defensive fire that should have stopped them cold. The Zephyrian gunners could not compensate for the reckless courage of crews who viewed their missions as opportunities for glorious sacrifice. General Paul Jackson commanded the overall assault from his flagship, a captured Zephyrian dreadnought that had been renamed Freedom's Price. His tactical display showed the progress of the battle as rebel forces overwhelmed Imperial defenses. Through sheer determination and tactical innovation, the Empire's rigid command structure was collapsing under the chaos of coordinated attacks from every direction. Emperor Theknoth watched his empire die from the command center of his fortress world. The species he had ruled for so long were tearing apart 2,000 years of imperial civilization with primitive weapons and suicidal tactics. Worse still, they were led by humans, the weakest and most pathetic race in the galaxy according to every imperial assessment. The defensive perimeter was breached when Captain Ben Clark's merchant fleet executed a coordinated, ramming attack against the main weapons platform. Converted freighters and passenger liners struck the massive structure at full acceleration, their reactor overloads creating a chain of explosions that lit up the system like a string of suns. The sacrifice cleared the way for the main assault fleet. Admiral Morrison led the Nevada II through the gap in the Imperial defenses, followed by hundreds of rebel vessels that poured fire into the remaining Zephyrian ships. The battle became a close-range brawl where human tactical flexibility gave them a crucial advantage over enemies who had relied on technological superiority for too long. Captain Danny Mitchell commanded a squadron of rebel fighters, that had infiltrated the Imperial fleet formation. His pilots had learned to operate captured Zephyrian vessels better than their original crews, turning the Empire's own technology against them with devastating effect. The psychological impact of seeing their ships in enemy hands was breaking Imperial morale. Intelligence Officer Carol Williams coordinated electronic warfare attacks that disrupted Zephyrian communication networks and command systems. Her teams had spent months studying Imperial protocols and frequencies, learning to speak the electronic language of the enemy fleet. When the final battle began, half the Zephyrian ships found themselves cut off from their commanders. The fighting reached the fortress world itself, when Captain Lisa Parker led a boarding assault against the Imperial Palace. She had been promoted to her own command after surviving the destruction of the original Nevada, and her reputation made her a natural choice to lead the most dangerous mission of the war. Her assault team consisted of volunteers from every species in the Rebel Alliance. Emperor Theknoth activated the final defense of his throne room, a force field generator that could withstand direct hits from capital ship weapons. But human engineers had studied every piece of Imperial technology they could capture, and they had found weaknesses in systems that the Zephyrians considered perfect. Ryan Torres had designed the equipment that would bring down the Emperor's last barrier. The force field collapsed under a barrage of precisely tuned electromagnetic pulses, leaving Theknoth face to face with the representatives of the species he had oppressed for so long. The Emperor reached for his personal weapon, a device that could kill dozens of attackers with a single discharge. But Lisa Parker was faster, and her simple projectile weapon proved more reliable than Imperial technology. Emperor Theknoth fell with a look of genuine surprise on his face. He had ruled the galaxy for 800 years and had never imagined that his empire could be brought down by primitive beings, armed with crude weapons and desperate courage. The shot that killed him was heard around the galaxy as word of his death spread through rebel communication networks. The fall of the Emperor broke the will of the remaining Imperial forces. Zephyrian ships throughout the galaxy began surrendering to rebel fleets rather than fighting hopeless battles. The rigid command structure that had maintained Imperial discipline for centuries collapsed without the Emperor's authority to hold it together. Admiral Morrison stood in the ruins of the Imperial Palace and activated a communication array that would carry her words to every corner of the galaxy. The Zephyrian Empire was ended, she announced to trillions of beings who had never known freedom. The age of conquest and oppression was over, replaced by an era where species would cooperate as equals rather than existing as masters and slaves. The celebration that followed lasted for weeks across hundreds of worlds. But even as the galaxy rejoiced in its newfound freedom, the rebels who had won the war remembered the price of their victory. Millions had died in the fighting, including countless heroes whose names would never be known. The USS Nevada and her crew of 43 had started a revolution that freed the galaxy, but they had paid for that freedom with their lives. A memorial was built on every free world in the galaxy, listing the names of those who had died fighting for liberty. At the top of every list were the words that Captain Jake Sullivan had spoken before his final battle. "You will not harm these people while I draw breath." Those words had become the rallying cry of a revolution that proved even the mightiest empire could fall if ordinary people found the courage to say no. The galaxy entered a new age where the weak were protected and the strong served justice rather than their own ambition. It was not a perfect age, for peace is always harder to maintain than war. But it was an age where freedom mattered more than fear, and where the example of one small ship continued to inspire those who faced impossible odds. The Nevada had taught the galaxy that victory was not always about winning battles. Sometimes it was about choosing to fight for what was right, regardless of the cost. In the end, that lesson proved more powerful than any weapon the Zephyrian Empire had ever built.